Here in Scotland, around 4,500 babies are born prematurely. That's under 36 weeks every year. It's a testing time for parents, but it's also an expensive time, with estimates suggesting the average additional cost to families is over £200 a week. SNP MP David Linden is campaigning for more support, more help for families with babies born prematurely. He joins me now in the studio. Morning, David.
Morning, Stephen. How you doing?
Thanks for your time. Yeah, I'm good today. This campaign's close to home for you, isn't it? Tell us your story.
Yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, I'm a father of two children. My most recent was born in September this year. Both my children were born prematurely and spent the early weeks of their lives on the neonatal intensive care unit here in Glasgow. And so in my case, both of fathers now obviously get 2 weeks worth of paternity leave, but in my case, both those 2 weeks were spent on the neonatal intensive care unit. So what I'm campaigning at the moment to do is to ask the UK government to recognise that a small number of families are in this position, and that the current situation is just not compatible with life on a neonatal intensive care unit. So that's why I asked the Prime Minister that question on Wednesday and hope to make some progress on this.
Talk to us about the dynamic, the family dynamic of what happens when a baby comes along prematurely.
Yeah, I mean, we had two different circumstances. The first time around, we had an emergency caesarean section for my wife. My son's heart rate dropped and had great difficulty with his breathing. So within minutes of him being born in the theatre, he was whipped up to neonatal intensive care. And I think this is the point that I was trying to get across to the Prime Minister on Wednesday, is when you walk into a neonatal intensive care unit and your child's in an incubator, they've got so many wires that they look like the back of a television, and they're being given assistance to breathe. That is an incredibly high-pressured environment, an incredibly tough time for any parent. And in our case, of both the cases for our children, that lasted for several weeks. Now, fathers are expected to go back to work after 2 weeks. And I was very fortunate this time around as an MP. I put my family first and decided that I was staying in that neonatal intensive care unit until my daughter came out. But some of the other fathers that I met were not in that position. I spoke to one guy who was saying, look, I'm on the sick at the moment, I might be able to take my paternity leave. But the problem is, under UK law, you've got to take that 2 weeks paternity leave within 56 days. So there are just a lot of difficulties. And it was interesting, after the PMQ on Wednesday, I had a dad who tweeted me to say that one of the hardest things wasn't just leaving his baby in that neonatal intensive care unit to go back to work, but it was leaving his wife there on her own. I mean, for anybody who's not seen what an NICU looks like, it's an incredibly tough environment, and to expect dads to go back to work within 2 weeks of that happening is really, really tough.
Paternity leave was not designed for that, was it? It's designed for you to be a help at home and for you to be able to support your partner and provide, extra support around the home as well, and to give some relief, breastfeeding or whatever as well. It's not for you to stand there staring at an incubator, which is what you were doing.
No, not necessarily. I mean, a lot of it's about making sure that my wife was getting support. So in my case, in both cases, my wife had a caesarean section. So when you've had a caesarean section, you can't drive for 6 weeks. So I was driving my wife back and forward to the hospital because there are wider issues around the provision of neonatal intensive care, one of which is that there is very, very limited accommodation in hospitals. So that's a bit of a problem, particularly in my wife's case when she was breastfeeding. So you were leaving the hospital at night because you can't stay there. The first time around, she was expressing milk and I was driving back and forward to the hospital every 4 hours. So that's not something she would be able to do. Because she's unable to drive. So that's one of the reasons why I would like to look at this again and make sure that we're providing the support for both parents. And I'm hopeful we'll get some change from the UK government.
There is another way of looking at this, which is in terms of what employers can do to help here. And it's a small number of babies that are born prematurely. Would you expect employers to be understanding in these circumstances, to be compassionate?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence that I've seen so far is that most employers will try and do their best to help out. But in some respects, that's a bit of a lottery depending on what employer you've got. So as I say, this time around, as an MP, I was able to take that decision that I would spend a bit of extra time with my family. But equally, there are there are other families who are put in a position where their employer says, well, I'm sorry, you've just got to come back to work. So that's why I want to have a look again at the statutory element of paternity leave. So there are some good employers out there that are doing really good work in terms of being compassionate. But if we're serious about this being for the kind of the many, so to speak, then that's why we need to change the law.
And that additional cost that we talked about in the introduction, David, up to £200 a week for families to cope with a premature baby. What's that cost from?
We're very fortunate in Scotland that there is a neonatal fund for parents there, so you can get provision support for maybe claiming for travel or for some of the meals in hospital. That's pretty unique in the UK. That does not exist anywhere else in the UK, so that's a fairly new thing in Scotland. But yeah, there are certainly costs around, if you've got to take time off work, you're travelling back and forward to the hospital as well, loss of earnings, all these kind of things. So that's why we need to look at changing the law on this.
David, stay with me. Here's Helen Currain, who's Campaigns and Policy Manager for the charity Bliss, which campaigns for premature babies. Helen, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for your time today. How big an impact does this have on some of the families you support?
It does have a huge impact, and we hear all the time from fathers as well as mothers about the barriers they face to being with their baby in hospital when they're very sick in those early weeks and months of their lives. As David already mentioned, there are a lot of costs associated with having a baby in neonatal care. It's fantastic that the Scottish Government provide an expenses fund, as David said, for meals and for travel. But parents face many other costs. They face childcare costs if they've got other children at home, loss of earnings, as David mentioned, and also have to pay for accommodation if they do want to stay nearer their baby in the specialist centre that may be far away from home. So there's a huge number of costs facing families to be with their baby on the unit and to provide that care that they need.
David's raised the specific point around parental leave. What else do you think could be done to make life easier for families, Helen, who have a premature child?
Well, we think it's really important that additional parental leave is paid. As we've already discussed, the costs are very high. So many parents, many dads are offered to take some unpaid leave from work. But that's just not a possibility for so many families. That's just not something that they can afford to do. So they do need the additional statutory paid leave, and that's what we're campaigning for, along with David, for changing UK government policy around that. Parents also need, as Dave mentioned, better accommodation provision at neonatal units and better facilities in general. So there needs to be a room where there's a kettle and a microwave and some basic facilities to enable parents to spend as much time as possible with their babies. There need to be comfortable chairs. That's not even the norm in many units across the country. By the baby's cot side, so that both parents can spend time with their baby and are encouraged to do so, and overnight accommodation, so that when their baby's really poorly, parents can always be close by. And also when they're breastfeeding, as David mentioned, they're supported to be able to do that.
It's a kind of hidden issue, Helen, isn't it, I guess, because families are just so relieved to have got through the birth and eventually to be able to get the baby home, that all concentration is on that rather than raising these concerns. That's your job, I guess.
That's right. That's what Bliss campaigns for, as well as improvements in the medical care that babies receive. That we also ensure that the facilities are there and the support is there for parents so that they can provide the care that their babies need, both in hospital and once they go home. So obviously parental leave also touches on the paid support for parents once they get back home, once their baby gets back home and is discharged from hospital. At the moment, that leave isn't long enough for many families. So their time at home, that special bonding time at home, is reduced. So that's what we're campaigning for.
David, you raised the matter with the Prime Minister on Wednesday. She's busy with a few things at the moment, but I know you've got a meeting with the Government Minister coming up. What's the timescale? What do you hope can be achieved and how quickly?
Well, I'm certainly planning to meet with the Government Minister before we adjourn for Christmas. The Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is looking at a review, which I think they're hoping to conclude in January. But I really don't want this to be running on much longer. That's twice now in my case, 3 years apart, that I've had kids and been through this experience. I know from being on these units, this is something people are going through every day. We can't waste much more time on this. So I'm very hopeful that when I meet the Minister in the next week or so, that we'll get some action on this and we can move on to deal with some of the bigger issues that you alluded to there, Stephen.
How are the kids?
Yeah, fine. My daughter's here with me today. She's down in the cafe. She is still on oxygen, so she'll be on oxygen until the end of the year. So that's proven to be a bit of a challenge at the moment because you're out and about. As an MP, I'm going to all these constituency Christmas fairs. My wife's carrying my daughter and I've got the oxygen in my back. So we're doing our best to try and get on with life as normal, but I'm acutely aware that Jessica spent a fairly small amount of time in neonatal intensive care. But the reality is there'll be lots of children lots of babies who'll spend Christmas Day in neonatal intensive care, and we must make sure we're giving all of their parents the support they need.
Happy Christmas to Jessica when it comes. Thank you for your time coming in. That's David Linden there, Glasgow East MP, dad of two. And you heard from Helen Currain as well, Campaigns and Policy Manager for the charity Bliss. 10:55 Friday morning, St Andrew's Day, BBC Radio Scotland.